You are calling us to follow. You are calling us to trust. You are seeing all our tomorrows. Greater things are yet to come. You lead us to new horizons.
With today's sermon in our series, Faith Lived Out Loud, Studies in the Book of James, here's Senior Pastor Mark Rader.
Well, I don't know how many of you have a car or have owned a car that has personality. Shortly after I got my license, I bought a car. You get what you pay for, and so my first car was rubbish. It had, I guess, what you would call personality. And what I mean by that was there's a whole bunch of quirks that only I understood. Right? So, if you kind of jiggled the handle just right and turned the key the right way, you could open the passenger door. But if you weren't me and you didn't know the secret, well, you were basically locked outside or had to climb in through the window or wait till I came and showed you. I actually managed my mechanical moment, the only moment of mechanical genius that I've ever had with that first car. Driving down the highway, hit a pothole, the battery hit the roof of the bonnet and shorted out because there were no things covering the terminals. The car coasted to the side. I had a tennis ball in the back of my car. I cut it in half, covered the terminal, solved the problem. I have never reached those heights since. I did it all at once. Who would have known that was the best it was going to be? But you've probably had these sorts of cars. Now, here's the problem about my little solutions. I didn't actually have enough money to solve the problem. I didn't have enough money to solve the problem. I didn't have enough money to go in and say to the guy, can you take apart my door and make it work so that anyone can just kind of get into the car? I didn't have enough money to do that, and so I just managed the problem, but I didn't actually deal with what needed to be dealt with. We can do that not just with cars, we can do it in our lives as well. I don't know if any of you have ever kind of cricked your neck or something, and so you end up walking funny to avoid hurting anymore, but by walking funny, you basically hurt something else, and soon your whole body is in pain instead of just dealing with it. Or you've got symptoms of some sort of medical condition, and instead of actually going to the doctor and getting some blood tests and figuring out what's going on, you just manage the symptoms. Well, James here is actually addressing some really significant symptoms in the life of the church that he is writing to. And they're really quite serious because this section, which we're going to begin to look at tonight, carries on essentially to the middle of chapter 4. And his concern, while it begins with teachers, is essentially wrapped around language, around speech, around people's words, the things they say, and how they say them. So the section that we're beginning with today begins by focusing on teachers, and throughout this section, which we'll cover over several weeks, it's kind of like teachers come into focus, and then James kind of backs off a little bit, kind of zooms out to bring in the whole community of faith, zooms back in on teachers every so often, zooms back out. And so this is not a section, nor are we in a little sub-series of 3 or 4 weeks where unless you're a teacher, you don't have to pay attention. This is a word for us wherever we might find ourselves. Because it's not only teachers who use their mouths, it is everyone. We all use words, right? And this is what James is concerned about here. Now, he begins with teachers, and the reason is in part because of the prestige and authority that teachers had. So he says, not many of you should become teachers, my fellow believers, because you know that we who teach will be judged more strictly. Now, teachers in antiquity, in the ancient world, were held in very high regard, in part because very few people in the population could read and write. We don't really know what the kind of literacy rates were, but there was probably less than 10%. And so those who could read and could write and could pass on what they had both read and perhaps had written were held in high regard. And this is true in the church as well. In Ephesians chapter 4, one of the gifts given to the church were teachers. In Romans 12 and 1 Peter 4, those who were capable of teaching were held as gifts and were gifts of the Spirit to the early church. And so James is addressing those who are teachers within the community of faith. And the stricter judgment that he mentions there is, I don't think, kind of a second level judgment. It's not as if we're going to get to the final judgment and there's going to be the judgment for all believers, and then would all the teachers please step forward for kind of the second type of judgment. The context here suggests why James says that there's a more significant judgment. And that's because of the outcome or the impact that these teachers can have and were having on the community of faith. And as we'll see in the weeks to come, James is not actually all that interested in the content of what they're teaching. So he doesn't talk about false doctrine. He doesn't talk about lousy theology. He doesn't address the kind of things that they were teaching in the church. He ends up talking about the impact that, shall we say, the rest of their teaching was doing. And the impact of their words on the community of faith were pretty severe. As we'll see in the weeks to come, he talks about disorder. He talks about slander. He actually talks about quarrels and fights, using two words in the Greek that suggest it may actually have been physical violence. So the impact of their teaching was that the church was getting into fisticuffs after the service. This is what James is addressing. But he doesn't get to the outcome yet. Here he just begins by talking about the significance of language and the things that we say. Now, this isn't new in James's letter. He's actually mentioned speech a handful of times. In chapter 1, verse 19, he says that everyone should be quick to listen and slow to speak and slow to become angry, linking speech with anger, which I think is fairly important. In verse 26 of the same chapter, he says that those who consider themselves religious and yet do not keep a tight rein on their tongues deceive themselves, and their religion is worthless. In chapter 2, verse 12, he says that we ought to speak and act as those who are going to be judged by the law that gives freedom. So James has already kind of laid the groundwork, shall we say, for this discussion about the influence and power of speech. But for the moment here, James wants to focus on the incredible power that our speech has. And so he begins with a handful of little illustrations of the terrible power of the tongue, both for good, but especially for ill. So did you notice the three little illustrations? He talks about a horse and a boat and a forest fire. In the first two, they're both kind of positive images, right? You can steer a horse or you can steer a boat using a very small bit or a very small, compared to the size of the boat, rudder. And both of those are quite positive because, generally speaking, while you can steer a boat into the rocks, generally speaking, people try to steer the boat to safety, right? And so there's this sense that our words can actually steer and guide and encourage and bring and sustain life, right? But the emphasis in these illustrations actually lies on the third, doesn't it? Because when James turns to talk about the power of the tongue for evil, his language changes. Did you hear how he describes the tongue? He says, the tongue is a small part of the body, but it makes great boasts. Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark. The tongue, he says, is also a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. Is his point clear? While our words can build and encourage and sustain life, they can also burn your whole life down. In fact, if we're not careful, our words can burn the whole world down. You don't have to study much history to know the power and influence of words in some of the great conflicts in our world, right? Our words can be used for good, but on the scale of good and evil, words seem to have a greater power for evil than they do for good. Now, to this point, shall I say, James is teaching us nothing that we needed the Bible for. Is he? We all know the power of words, don't we? We know the power of words to both heal and to destroy. Because every single one of us has had someone or someones speak words of healing, restoration, encouragement, and hope into our lives. And every single one of us has had someone who has spoken words that have stung and cut and broken us. And chances are, each of us have also used words to both heal and to harm. I don't need the Bible to tell us that, do we? We know the power of words, and we know the negative power of words. You know how it all works. You have a crack at something and you get 10 people who say, that was fantastic, and one person who gives you some criticism. What do you remember at the end of the day? That's not the 10 positive words, is it? It's the criticism. It's the criticism that sticks. You don't need James to tell us this. Words have incredible power. We know this. And James goes on to say that, even though we know the power of words, he says we seemingly cannot control them. He said, which is kind of a little bit ludicrous given the sorts of things that we can control. He uses the examples of animals and reptiles and birds and stuff. Imagine what he would say if he got to go to SeaWorld today. If he saw the sorts of things that we control. We control all sorts of stuff. We control the temperature of our homes. We control the airwaves. We now can fly places. We have nuclear energy, an incredibly powerful tool that lights our homes. We can tame and control all of these things. And yet, James's bottom line doesn't change. Nobody can control the tongue. Nobody can control the tongue. And the evidence, he says, is in the language. He said you hear people who bring both praise and cursing, or blessing and cursing, kind of big kind of headings that we could use for words of life and words of death. Anything that heals and sustains and encourages and brings hope is a word of blessing. Anything that does the opposite is a word of curse. He said this is how we know. This is how we know what we're up against. This is what James is on about. Now, the second verse of this section, he kind of outlines, I guess, a bit of a principle. He says that we all stumble in many ways. Anyone who is never at fault in what they say is perfect, able to keep their whole body in check. And if you've been kind of paying attention, you'll know that this is one of James's themes. He's been very interested in perfection, in completion, in maturity. So last week, it's our works that perfect or mature or complete our faith. In chapter 1, he says it is trials that we endure, that we persevere through, and they will perfect or mature our faith. Once again, he's on about perfection. He's on about completion. He's on about maturity, this time in relationship to the power of the tongue. Remember what he says about the tongue and being able to control the tongue in its association with worthwhile religion, a religion that actually has value. But here's what I find really striking about what James has to say. Because James does not advocate for greater self-control. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't stop there and say, so you lot, just show a little bit of self-discipline. Would you just be a little bit more self-controlled? It's a fruit of the Spirit, don't you know? Get on to it. Just be a little bit better. It's interesting that that's not what James says. Now, I'm sure he wouldn't disagree with the value of self-discipline. I'm sure he wouldn't disagree with the significance and the importance of self-control. It is a fruit of the Spirit, and it's something that ought to be evident in our lives. But I think the reason why James doesn't talk about self-control here is actually found in the last little section. In verses 11 and 12, he says this: "Can both fresh water and salt water flow from the same spring? Can a fig tree bear olives or a grapevine bear figs? Neither can a salt spring produce fresh water." And notice that in these illustrations, he's talking about the source of something and how the source produces one type of thing and one type of thing only. So if you find a freshwater spring and you go to the freshwater spring hoping for Gatorade, you're going to be disappointed. It only produces fresh water. If you go to a grapevine hoping for a pineapple, you're going to be disappointed. Because the source, the root, will actually kind of determine the sort of fruit that you're going to receive. That's the way it works. Pretty straightforward, isn't it? But here's the point that he's making. That the problem with our words is not actually more or less self-control. It's actually our heart. The source of our words. There's the problem. And this, as we've seen a number of times in James's teaching, reflects some of Jesus' teaching. Let me draw your attention to Matthew chapter 15. If you have your Bibles and want to turn to that. Jesus has been confronted by some of the religious teachers who were asking why his disciples hadn't washed their hands before eating, which was not a matter of hygiene. It was a matter of kind of clean and unclean in Jewish food laws. And Jesus says to them in verse 11, to the crowd, he says, "What goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, but what comes out of their mouth, that is what defiles them." And when his disciples ask him what he means by that, in verse 17, he says, "Don't you see that whatever enters the mouth goes into the stomach and then out of the body? But the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart. The words people speak come from their heart, and these things defile them. For out of the heart, manifested in words, come evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person." In the Sermon on the Plain in Luke, he says that what comes out of the mouth is what the heart is full of. This is James's point. And again, to some degree, we don't need him to tell us this because we know it, don't we? You know the reason why words spoken in anger are impossible to take back? They're impossible to take back because they come from the heart. Those words that I said in anger, knowing that they would hurt you, are words that I have harbored in my heart. And I may never have said them to you because I care for you and I love you and I don't want to hurt you, but in a moment of anger, I say what I have hidden and harbored in my heart. And you know that I've said those words from my heart, don't you? Because you've done the same. I don't have some sort of sentence generator in my brain that randomly spits out sentences. I can't say, I don't know where that came from. That was a complete accident. I'm as surprised as you are at that very hurtful thing I just came up with. It doesn't work that way, does it? There is a connection between our heart and our tongues. In our day and age, our heart and our thumbs, perhaps, that is very, very strong. And words spoken in anger, even words spoken in jest, cannot be taken back. The damage is done. Can you see why self-control isn't actually going to help? Because the problem isn't just controlling your mouth. It's not just a matter of counting to 10 and gritting your teeth. James's point is that the source of your words are the problem. Your heart is the problem. The reason why you speak words of death and sometimes words of life is because your heart is divided. It is imperfect. It is immature. It is incomplete. This is the problem. So do you want to know how complete and mature and perfect your heart is? Well, listen to the things you say, and you will know. We have to listen carefully, though, because there's not a one-to-one connection between our words and our heart. So, for instance, when I speak words of anger, it doesn't mean that I have an angry heart. It means I have a heart that is filled with self-love. Because that's why I'm angry. I didn't get my way. Things didn't work out the way I wanted them to. And so I respond in anger because I love myself too much. When I hear words come out of my mouth of ingratitude, when I'm complaining and whining about the circumstance, it's not just because I have an ungrateful heart, it's because I am filled with greed. I want more. And because I don't have all that I think I should, all that I deserve to have, I see nothing to be thankful for. When I speak words of slander or gossip, it's because I have a heart filled with envy. When I speak words of arrogance and boasting, it's not just pride, it's fear. What do your words say about the state of your heart? You see, we have a very casual approach to language these days. Maybe it's because we're expected to respond to everything. Maybe it's because of the internet and social media. Maybe it's because of postmodern deconstructionism or post-truth or any number of things. It doesn't really matter, but we have a very casual attitude towards language as if it doesn't matter. I don't know how casual fashion works, and I understand that you can spend an awful lot of money to get the casual look just right. But casual for me means if it's clean and mostly ironed, it's good to go. Right? I don't have to think about it much. That's why I like casual. But if we apply that thinking to our speech, where our words are not thought about, then we are potentially releasing all sorts of sparks to the wind. And who knows how many forest fires we're going to set alight, not because we were trying to, not because we were angry, but because we were careless. And here's why it matters so much. You see, what James is going to go on to say is that your words are having an impact in the life of the community. It's where he focuses back on the teachers. Your words are having an impact in the community of faith. And so it's divided and it is disorderly and there is slander and there is fighting. And that means that the community of faith cannot be what God has always wanted the community of faith to be, which is an example to the world of the good news of Jesus Christ. Your words, James says, are intimately connected to the ability of the church to complete its mission. And the last thing that you really need is more self-control. You need a new heart. Because when you have a new heart, you will no longer need self-control. Isn't that a wonderful thought? Jesus doesn't want people who are just more self-disciplined, who show greater moral resolve. He wants new people. People whose hearts are undivided. People whose hearts are pure and perfect and complete and mature. You know, the virtues which are so valuable to us here of self-control and gentleness and all those things, we won't need them when we are completely made new, will we? Because if my heart is pure, then the source of my words is pure, and the things that I say will be pure, and the impact that those words will then have in the community of faith will be beneficial and life-giving, and then we will complete our mission. You see, the words of self-control are not actually the words of the gospel. Because just being more self-controlled in our speech, it's just hard work. The gospel of grace is this: that Jesus will give you a new heart, an undivided heart. He will do it in His power and in His time. And our self-control, like faith and works, as James talks about, work together. But ultimately, it is the work of God. And James has already said that every good and perfect gift comes down from the Father, who chose to give us birth through the word of truth that we might be a kind of first fruits of all He created. So, what do your words tell you about the state of your heart? And what are you going to do about it? Are you just going to try for more self-control? Bite your tongue, count to 10? Fine. But the good news is that you can have a new heart.
We hope you've enjoyed today's New Horizons program. You can download the companion study guides for each program from the Guymer Baptist Church website. Go to guymerbaptist.org.au/New Horizons. These are available for each episode, or you can download the whole series. Guymer Baptist Church in Sydney's southern suburbs is a contemporary evangelical church seeking to serve our local community and help them to know Jesus. At the heart of all we do is the desire to help people love God in all aspects of their lives. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so via the contact page on our website or visit our Facebook page.
In this passage, James makes a really important point about our words. And the point that he makes that I think is so significant for us to reflect on is that it's not just a matter of controlling the tongue, it's actually about renewing our hearts. Thankfully for us, we don't have to just manage our tongues, finding more and more self-control. Instead, we have been invited into the good news of the gospel. That is, that we have been given a new heart, a good and perfect gift from our Heavenly Father. I hope that you have invited the Holy Spirit again into your life to restore and renew your heart, that your words might be pure and perfect, complete and mature. God bless, and we hope to see you again soon.